Siegel here.
Commissioner Forcell here.
Mike Danaher here.
Commissioner Schwartz here.
Johnston here.
Okay, thank you. Any oral communication? The minutes, any comments on those? Motion to approve?
I'll move to approve.
All right, I hear a second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Agenda review. We talked about it on Monday and decided not to make any changes. That's on the supposition that we'll get through the water leak action very quickly. Reports from commissioner meetings and events. I expect nothing less. Go ahead.
Okay. This month, I went to the annual meetings of NARUC, which is the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and NASUCA, which is a comparable meeting for consumer advocates. And that was in Baltimore and on November 13th and 14th. And, you know, again, I think that one of the things that it shows is that the commissioners that oversee the investor-owned utilities spend a lot of time learning about different issues and have a lot of discussions and are really good. And there isn't something I don't think that's comparable for municipal boards, but I think it's done on a case-by-case basis. So they really are a good model for us to look at in terms of educating ourselves. And there was an interesting panel on millennials and how millennials approach both communication and energy use differently. And so that's something that if anybody's interested, let me know and I'll put you in touch to get the report that was presented. There was also a breakfast that was looking at new alliances to encourage, that was on EVs and looking at how to get technology companies to work with utilities and particularly investor-owned utilities to make more charging stations available. And again, I've encouraged the city staff, and I mentioned it to the mayor, that I think this is an initiative that we can actually play a leadership role in and should, and the fact that we are a small municipal utility won't matter because we have such a high concentration of EVs here. And so I think some of our experiences will be relevant, and we may find that there are some ideas that we get that we can apply. The other meeting that I went to was the Low Income Energy Issues Forum in Atlanta on November 29th and 30th. And we did a customer journey mapping exercise to look at what do low-income customers go through when they're recognizing that they need assistance. And I was very much humbled by, there were like over 50 participants, and quite a few of them were from Georgia Power, because it was located like across the street from their offices. But you know, there were a lot of different utilities represented, and there are some just amazing programs being done. And I think it's very easy in our bubble of affluence to forget that there are people in Palo Alto who are struggling and having trouble making ends meet and dealing with the high rents, and that we shouldn't just assume that this is not an issue for people. And so I think it's something, you know, Commissioner Danaher, Chair Danaher has talked about that we can have on the agenda and talk about, and I think we really should pursue that because it probably is more of an issue in Palo Alto than we might realize. And then Commissioner Siegel and I met with the staff to discuss outreach, and that was a fun conversation, and so I'll let her talk about that a little more.
So we had the opportunity to meet with, I think, 7 staff members is it 7? To talk about different ways to reach more of the community, different mechanisms to reach different members of the community, and it was a good conversation. We had some ideas, including possibly adding a column to the weekly to try to reach a new segment of the community, different discussions about what to put in inserts and other ways to reach greater members of the community and try to get a broader base feedback, with a concern that we have a very active small group in the community who may not be good representatives of the general views of the community. Do you want to add to that?
I think just that we can do a combination of using technology that is, since we have a very active, we have segments of the community who are very active in terms of their adoption and use of technology, and that there are platforms available that other groups have done. And then the other thing is that we have to be proactive into going after different constituencies, that we can't just assume that people are going to show up or look at the website or just read their inserts, that, you know, that we have to be more assertive in how we go find them and invite them to work with us.
Thank you both for making the time to meet with staff on that. Really appreciate it. Any other commissioner reports? Okay. General Manager, Ed.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. First off, let me also echo the thanks for spending time with staff on communications issues. I think that when we talk about the strategic plan, we'll be able to come back to some of the follow-up related there. Do have a few items to note for the commission's information. First is related to the SunShares program. Give you an update. Registration for the Bay Area SunShares Solar Group Buy program ended on November 30th. And as has become the pattern, Palo Alto placed first among participating outreach partner communities with 12 signed contracts as of the most recent report from BC3, the organization administering the program. Palo Alto came in second to the city of San Francisco for number of people registered, with 150 registrants. And in order to be eligible for the program discounts, residents need to sign solar contracts by December 31st, so there's still a window there. After that date, we'll receive final numbers for the PV capacity contracted for installation through this program. Also, you may have seen a recent notification related to our net energy metering program. We have an item coming forward to the City Council on December 11th that relates to fixing a date by which residents can, or property account holders can put in for our current net energy metering program. Given the widespread solar adoption throughout the city, this will be ending soon, in which again, for the Commission's background, the NEM program is one in which customers receive retail credit for the electricity their solar system exports to the grid. The city will transition to our NEM successor program once we have reached a capacity of 10.8 megawatts of cumulative solar installed for customers enrolled under this existing program. We're actually expecting to reach this threshold in the month of December. And so in order to provide certainty for those who are currently in process, the item we're bringing forward to the City Council on the 11th will fix the current NEM program to extend through the end of December. So we wanted to provide a specific date. And actually through January 2nd, which is the first business day after December 31st. Let's see, after January 2nd, all customers will be served by the NEM successor program, and that this change will ensure that all customers currently evaluating solar can apply under this existing program. Also provides for a smooth transition, and again, that certainty to the successor. Let's see, next, perhaps this falls under the closing the loop department. The Georgetown University Energy Prize. Some of you may recall that from actually a couple of years ago. This is a program through which the City of Palo Alto, along with 49 other communities throughout the U.S., have participated in this, again, Georgetown University Energy Prize competition. As originally envisioned, the program included a $5 million prize, which generated much enthusiasm, and the city's been working to develop a number of innovative programs, including outreach to schools and collaboration with the Cool Block neighborhood program, as well as tracking and reporting energy savings at family level. In the end, this was a bit disappointing, as Georgetown officials announced in April that the prize was not $5 million in cash, but instead the opportunity to secure $5 million in financing. And as a follow-up to that, last month, the...
Sounds like our Google Fiber.
Yes, sorry, too familiar. In the end, in November, a press release announced top 10 finalist communities, of which the City of Palo Alto is one. And so while we'll continue through this competition, again, it's basically over. And so we'll track it and report as it reaches its conclusion. Let's see, carbon offsets under our natural gas program. As you may recall, in December, just to confirm, on this past Monday, December 4th, the City Council adopted a resolution approving an agreement to purchase carbon offsets associated with the forestry program near our sister city of Oaxaca, Mexico, to help Palo Alto maintain our net zero carbon footprint. City's investment of $136,000 will offset about 10% of the annual emissions caused by natural gas use within the city, and will support conservation and restoration activities within a large area, 59,000 acres of native forest, as well as co-benefits for the Oaxacan community, including fire protection, tree care, freshwater spring recharge, transportation and equipment for local schools. The carbon offsets generated by the Oaxaca forestry projects are similar to those contemplated in our base program, our carbon neutral natural gas program adopted by the city in 2016, last year. Mexican Forestry Project Protocol, developed by the Climate Action Reserve, one of the largest offset registers in North America, used by CARB. And finally, let's see, upcoming events and workshops. Just wanted to bring to the Commission's attention that we are having a community workshop associated with Utilities Underground District 47. This is a longstanding program spanning parts of University South and Professorville neighborhoods. This will be a meeting on December 7th. Actually, tomorrow night. City Council adopted an ordinance establishing this Underground District 47 in January 2013. So this has been a project in the works for some time. Utilities undergrounding converts the utility lines from overhead to underground, removing poles and overhead structures. City completed our substructure work to underground our utilities in this area has been completed, and is now time for residents and property owners to ready their existing services for connection underground. The community meeting planned for tomorrow night is intended to help residents understand what's required to complete their conversion of utility services for this final phase of the undergrounding project. Meeting will be at Addison Elementary School tomorrow, 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. And project details are available on our city website, cityofpaloalto.org/utility projects. Final item of note is a calendar, that your January meeting is scheduled for January 3rd, and we anticipated that was not a good date, and so as such, we'll proceed with canceling that date, and we'll be issuing a doodle poll to try to find another date in January. That concludes my report.
Thank you very much. Next agenda item is discussion of the North Council study session. I had a few takeaways from that, but why don't I just make that point and then we'll let anybody else chime in. I found interest on the council in resiliency. They appreciated looking into that. Interest in the fiber, I'd like us to look into that further, and interest in transportation as a big topic for the city, but also a major part of our carbon problem. there was a comment that it was okay for us to suggest agenda items for council, but very, very sparingly. And we got the message. And okay to find other modalities other than the minutes if we want to communicate something to the council, and we can work with staff on that. I mean, we'll wait till the time comes, but people would appreciate the input. Was there, most of you were there, any other comments, takeaways from that? I think, AJ, you were there.
I wasn't there, and I'm very sorry to miss it. We had a family Thanksgiving on the East Coast, and I hadn't made it back in time. But I did review the tape, the
Oh,
video.
good for you.
And I actually came away with the same takeaways that you just listed: the fiber, transportation, particularly EVs, and resilience. So that's what came out to me as the things that council was interested in, and that they really are looking for, our thoughts on those items.
Anybody else? Okay.
I thought generally it was nice that they were, receptive to talking. I thought it was a little short. It was hard in 45 minutes to cover all the topics that I would have liked to talk about. The thing that I think got short shrift was the workforce issue, and what are some of the creative things we should do as a city to try and make it easier for new people to come and work for the utilities. And so, that might be something that at a later date, that can be one of the things that we can bring back. But, I thought generally they were receptive to what we had to say, and I thought it was also very nice that it seemed to me that in the past, we were sort of told, like when you and I joined the commission, it was kind of, we were sort of told what to do, and I got the feeling that this council was really much more interested in what we had to say and to hear from us on particular topics. So I found that gratifying.
All right, thank you. Great. Well, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is on the water leak program. We've had one or two discussions on this, and there's a new proposal here. And we have 5 minutes for this on the agenda, which should be plenty.
Good evening, Commissioners. Tom Ozen, the Assistant Director of Utilities for Customer Support Services. As we go forward in our months-long discussion, back and forth, I'm pleased to bring you what I believe is a more concise, more simple, more fair, and generally a very, very consumer-friendly product. Back to the commission. So, in your packet, I'd like to point out a couple of things that are different from the last iteration that you've seen. Under the discussion section of Section B, we're proposing to replace some of the existing language in Rule and Regulation 11, the billing adjustment and payment of bills. Section 5, leaking systems must be repaired before the customer receives a water leak adjustment to ensure that future bills are not impacted by the same leak. We had talked a little bit about this a while back, and we've taken out a lot of the bureaucratic requirements and proof of service, proof of completion. Basically, we will take people's word for it that the issue has been resolved, and they can submit bills or other paperwork to us, and that's fine. But also to the Commission's suggestion, we still retain the undetermined or general high water consumption as not eligible for adjustment because it's indeterminate as to how that occurred or where that occurred or whether it's a leaking toilet or whatnot. And such a thing is not necessarily a permanent leak. We've also basically met the customer halfway, I think, in putting a maximum of $2,500 adjustment on our side. That, in our analysis, will cover probably 90% of the leaks that have happened in the past. And I think that's what customers have been looking for, is mutual pain and suffering.
So we share it 50/50, above the I-1.
Yeah, pretty much, up to the maximum of 2,500. The excess water consumption, as we've determined here in the language, would be billed at the Tier 1 rate, which is $6.66 per CCF, rather than the current Tier 2 rate, which is $9.16. And so we'll bill it to that level. UUT, utility users tax, currently at 4.75%, is not counted in that $2,500 cap. Any wastewater adjustment would also not be counted towards that $2,500 cap. That takes into account commercial customers. So that takes care of that section. We've also modified another section of Rule and Regulation 11, where we've clarified where a customer's been overcharged or undercharged for metered service. The retroactive billing adjustment, either back bill or refund, shall not exceed 3 years, which corresponds to the current statute of limitations. And so that's pretty much goes forward. The other section where there has been an overcharge, we propose the following language that will allow us to review on a case-by-case basis those overcharges, so that we can sit there and, if necessary, we can forgive those overcharges that are not the fault of the customer. And so, again, that clarifies another outstanding issue in that rule and regulation that's been there for a while. We don't really have an anticipation for what the financial impacts will be. We'll give it a year and see what happens.
All right. Well, thank you. This is more concise, more clear, and it reflects the discussion we had with staff. I think it's very good. Now, we've had several discussions. Any commissioners want to discuss further?
I just had a question about how the 50% worked. So in paragraph 6, the leak adjustment will apply to 50% of the calculated higher than average, just so I understand. So if you calculate, for example, that the average was 100 CCF, and in a particular period the customer had used 300 CCF, how would you calculate the 50%?
In that, I would refer you back to section 4, where the higher than average consumption would be defined as the volume of water greater than 100% of the customer's normal.
So that would be 200 CCF in this case.
Right, correct.
And so the charge that would be forgiven would be for 100 of
correct.
that? Okay.
All right. And the rest would be under the lower Tier 1 rate.
Correct.
Great. Any further questions? Is there a motion on that?
I'll move that we recommend to the council the adoption of the Rule and Regulation 11 as reflected in the staff's report.
Thank you. Second? All right, second. All in favor? Aye. Aye. All right, that's unanimous. Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioners. A pleasure doing business with you.
It'll make your job easier or nicer to those consumers. All right. On to the utilities strategic plan.
Okay, let's see. So this evening, I'd like to provide what I'll describe as kind of the last block or last piece of the building blocks that we've had coming to the commission over the last several months, and walk you through what's effectively an overview of all of the pieces. Our plan is to get your feedback tonight and perhaps let this sit with the commission for a month, and then next month come back with a recommendation for your approval. Then we would forward it to the City Council for review. So with that, let me give you a pretty quick little run through. what we have before you. What you see is a photo of our entire department, or as close as we could get to the entire department, one place at one time. This is our periodic all-hands meeting at Mitchell Park. And so overall, we've got about 250 employees within the department, and I appreciate noting, obviously, that we are a service organization, and as such, it's really accomplished through our people. And as I think the chair pointed out recently, is I was communicating an ongoing operational issue, a reminder that while the commission in our discussion much often focuses on policies and our programs, that 98% of our work is our operations, and so reflected in the folks pictured here. Let's see, just to give you a quick overview of what we have before you, we'll walk through the process we've undertaken to get to this point in our strategic plan, the results, the elements of our strategic plan, our mission statement and strategic direction as direct statements, and our approach, which is reflected a number of focus areas, the strategies within each focus areas, performance indicators, and where we go from here. Just a quick overview of the process to date. I know it's a little difficult to read, but the dark band in the middle being the timeline from July, in effect, really the more intense portion of our work to date, December over to the right side, and again, early next year, in January to March timeframe to finish off this effort. Intentionally, a relatively compressed time frame in which we could retain attention, both as an organization as well as in our community outreach. The highest level of the graphic here reflecting the employee input and employee engagement, starting off with an all-hands meeting. We've had what we refer to as our core planning team, about 24 individuals that have spent significant time from operations, administration, resource management, engineering, and the like, to customer support, lest I forget, to focus on the various dimensions of how this plan would come together, and touch points with a larger staff along the way. Then proceeding down vertically, more of our public-facing meetings, both the check-ins with the UAC, a few specific stakeholder meetings where we invited key customers as well as community advocates to come in and drill down on more specific issues of interest for them, and then really progressing through the process of the initial input and development of options, issues, and then recommendations. This infographic, just a little bit of nostalgia back to 2011, the last strategic plan adopted for the department, which has been monitored and reported on regularly since. In effect, what this infographic reflects is what was the prior approach, was effectively to encompass all the work that the department does in a few specific areas, ranging from financial strength to rate structures and the like. You see on the left financial resources as key elements leading into our people and technology, our business processes, and then ultimately impacts on customers and the priorities reflected within each one of those phases of the work that we do. What we've done this go around is a little different in that we, instead of trying to encompass everything that we do as an overall business enterprise, we've taken the approach of really focusing on key priority areas to reflect the needs both of the organization, of the customers that we serve, and to attempt at reflecting the evolution of the utilities industry as well. So in so doing, walking through our basic mission to be clear on that, but then proceeding to some specific and just a handful of priority areas, the strategies that we've identified in order to address those priority areas, and then ultimately rubber hits the road on specific actions that we would be undertaking within, again, each priority and strategy. Just a quick recap on the top line. No surprise, no change. Mission of Palo Alto's utilities is to provide safe, reliable, environmentally sustainable, and cost-effective services. We recite this every morning as we come to work. No, we don't. But it is not far from the day-to-day conversations that we have, because safe, reliable, environmentally sustainable is really core to the daily work that we do. And in our strategic destination, really trying to reflect more of, again, timeliness of a focus within this strategic plan, recognizing at CPAU, our people in power, tomorrow's ambitions while caring for today's needs. Really trying to balance the forward-looking Palo Alto that we are with the recognition of not forgetting today's needs and the individuals, in many cases vulnerable individuals that we serve. And our statement of making this possible with our outstanding professional workforce, leading through collaboration and optimizing resources to ensure a sustainable and resilient Palo Alto. You'll see reflected in both the priorities and strategies and actions. The focus areas before, just again, a little bit of a high-level recap that we had our financial resources, people and technology were connected together in the prior go-round, leading to our business processes and the effect on the customer. Oops, let's see, so we can pass this. And then now trying to simplify a bit by recognizing somewhat the ecosystem that we are operating within, focusing on 4 specific areas. Workforce, as Commissioner Schwartz pointed out earlier, definitely a high focus area for us at this moment in time. Elevation of collaboration as a focus area, and we'll talk a bit about the specific ways that we take that on. Technology as a tool, and you've noticed the separation between the technology and the workforce, no longer synonymous, not that they ever were, but really recognizing the distinction between our people and the tools that our people use, and then our finances and resources, which is, as you'll see, something of a catch-all and pretty involved area itself.
So Ed, you had a conflict Monday, so we weren't able to have our call, but I was able to talk to your colleagues here. And anticipating the commission has all read this.
Yes.
And what I wanted to hear from you folks is, how does this change what you're doing, or what does it mean? Because a lot of this is certainly just reiterating good business practices. Some of it's reiterating things that you do. What does this mean in terms of the department that you're going to do differently as a result of this exercise?
Thank you. Perfect segue, because I would like to highlight just a few of the bullets you see on this sheet and a few others. We have adopted this numbering system just to make it a little more easily trackable, because we've got a number, again, strategies and actions. So if I could jump to S1A1, which is the strategy around establishing our organization where our employees are proud to be here and attract others. This first action of developing individual development plans is really an outcome of the discussions that we've had among our core planning team, and again, rolling further out to really look at an individual level at how we are supporting and providing career paths for our individuals that in some ways, quite frankly, it may seem a little common sense, but organizationally does take a focus in order to be able to connect the individual performance, individual interests, and how that then rolls into the organizational impact. And in particular, recognizing the generational turnover that we have, and again, not unusual or not unique, but to be very specific and intentional in recognizing within each one of these individual development plans that there's, unlike what may have been assumption in the past, it's not all about promoting. That in some cases, our individuals are more focused on the mastery of their craft, whether it be electrical, water, gas, wastewater, or the like, and that becoming really a master at it in and of itself does provide value to the organization. And let's say from a perspective of succession planning, the individual development plan may focus either on developing those skills, or in other cases, how they're establishing their own legacy by passing on those skills to the next generation in the workforce. So to be very intentional and provide this framework that facilitates a recognition of the value that at different points in an individual's career, they can nonetheless contribute both to the organization and the work that we do. So again, just using that as a specific example, I would identify one more, which is this S3, Strategy 3, pursuing alternative work and workforce solutions and workforce balance solutions. The process of going through this strategic plan really provided an opportunity for line staff, many of whom work shifts, with professional staff. You know, we have PhDs and we have linemen. And so recognizing that there are different approaches to work, some that provide more flexibility for work shifts and the time and the method through which that work is done, while recognizing the value that each provides, but that could involve differing shifts and different levels of flexibility in how the timing works. So I think that has been productive, and embodying that as a part of the strategic plan is an important step. Let's see, perhaps just a couple others to acknowledge here, since, again, recognizing the limited time. Collaboration in particular is a new focus for the department, and I would argue a pretty groundbreaking one. It is very easy for us to focus specifically in the operations and, you know, as they say, the way things have always been done, but more importantly, that, you know, the ability for us to invite and facilitate partnerships from at the community level to interdepartmental level to within the departments are not necessarily, let's say, automatic or top of mind. So we are institutionalizing the opening of the doors, the opportunities to seek collaborations on an ongoing basis. The most immediate example of which we talked last month, this planning approach we're using with this distributed energy resources. Really picking up, quite frankly, again, a nod to Commissioner Schwartz, discussions we've had over the last several months, and other commissioners as well, about market segmentation, recognizing the variety of circumstances that our customer base reflects, and not assuming that we're always or that we will cater our programs to the leading edge, to the early adopters, but instead recognizing the breadth of circumstances that our customer base is in, and really trying to more deeply design our programs in order to hit all segments, or more deeply segments such as the EV market, where it may not simply be the early adopters that we want to address and meet their priorities, especially given our goal being to scale our integration of electric vehicles. So with that, maybe I'll just pass through and won't really touch on the specifics here. I'll open it up for your questions and discussions. Again, we've got specific action items in each one of our areas. I mentioned finances and resources really being the most elaborate one. We've got a pretty significant work plan within this area. Jonathan Abenshine's leading that team, and I would say I've been cautious about overcommitting there, but nonetheless, we're going to take this on and really facilitate our implementation of our performance indicators and our metrics within our operations. So with that, just a summary graphic that we're using on a working scale in order to be able to identify on one page the various elements that we'll be focusing on, that once Commission recommendation and Council approval, we'll be tracking and reporting on an ongoing basis. And I mentioned Jonathan leading one of the teams, Dean Batchelor's leading our workforce team, and so each one of these priority areas has a team and a lead established with them. We're still talking about we'll say the tour of duty that will be required of folks who agree to participate in each one of these teams, but the goal really to maintain and facilitate active engagement of the workforce over the next many years. So with that, I'll turn it back to the Commission.
Thank you. Judith, I know you had a question?
Yeah, so one of the sort of major barriers for a lot of utilities has been the tendency to have operations occur in silos. Okay, and since you have collaboration as one of the focus areas, what are you doing and what are you seeing as happening that might occur, that might be causing us to not have silos or to break down the silos that exist in other places?
Let's see, so I'll give you a couple of examples. It really does relate to the way we approach some of the programs. I mentioned the DER strategy and distributed energy resources in looking to more two-way communication from a customer base. That also applies internally, and in fact, when we get to the Sustainability Climate Action Plan, how we are attacking the area of electric vehicles, of energy, just as a couple of examples, really being set up with a specific attention to the cross-departmental, cross-discipline, can't think of a better word than opportunities that we might otherwise miss if we stay focused on whether it be the building permit process or our own, let's say, rebate programs. So instead, really looking at it, in this case, from a customer perspective, on what are the touch points that, let's say, a homeowner who's interested in purchasing an electric vehicle might benefit from either information or streamlining in the entire process with the utility, from the decision to buy, how that might affect their decision to upgrade electrical systems at home, and moving forward on everything to parking and permitting and the like.
Have you done any customer journey mapping? That's sometimes a good exercise to sort of break through the internal silos, because when you look at it from the customer's perspective, that's independent of how the utility is organized.
Great point. We haven't specifically, but that certainly could be a tool going forward.
Lisa, please.
So I wanted to ask about the strategies and actions make a lot of sense, thank you. The key performance indicators for the workforce priorities make a lot of sense. They're measurable: employee turnover rates, number of vacant positions, days to fill. I assume employee satisfaction can be measured with some kind of a survey. How do you measure employee collaboration on the collaboration priority? And what do you see as performance indicators for priority 4, where none are listed? Because, to state the obvious, it's you manage what you measure, so I'm curious how you measure some of these.
Just to perhaps start with the last one, priority 4 actually extended over 2 pages, and so it's on the second page of priority 4. And actually, is Catherine here? Yes. I'm going to ask Catherine to speak to the collaboration piece, and she's been leading that team, given the opportunity.
Sorry to miss the second page. That's a good list.
Good evening, Commissioners. Catherine Elvert, Utilities Communications Manager. I am actually pulling up my documents right now so I can read off some of these key performance indicators or some KPIs. So to your point, Commissioner Forcell, collaboration is more of a qualitative approach, more of a qualitative process and priority. It is not necessarily easy to provide quantitative metrics to measure the success as per we might be able to do with some of our financial and resource optimization items. So we have looked at some elements that will allow us to assess our reach with our external stakeholders and also our internal stakeholders. So with external stakeholders, we can assign some numbers in terms of, let's say, customer participation or response to customer solicitation mechanisms, right? We can look at some employee satisfaction for some internal collaboration metrics. So customer satisfaction, employee collaboration, and then of course, customer awareness of programs and services. So Ed had mentioned that we are making a concerted effort to consider a comprehensive approach to our outreach with customers and work to really assess what our customers are interested in, what their awareness is of the various technologies, the various initiatives that we do have to offer as a utility, what their interest is in engaging with us, and we're going to be exploring that more through a number of different survey methodologies. We had a great conversation with Commissioners Schwartz and Siegel last week or the week before, and so we're going to be applying some of those as we move forward with our strategic plan approach. So some of those...
Oh, sorry, I thought you were done. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I did pause for a moment. So some of those metrics can be assessed through some of our customer satisfaction surveys. So for example, you know, you can assign some ratings and you can get some percentage numbers there.
And then just specifically on the employee collaboration, I think this one was still a work in progress. We were kicking around the potential use of a survey similar to what Catherine described in terms of customer service, but in this case it was focused on the employees and querying impressions such as whether the organization was or that they were aware of impacts that the organization was having on the work that they do and that the work that they were doing having impact on the organization.
So I really like this. I spent some time with it. I struggle a little, struggle a little bit with whether priority 4 should really be the last priority. But I understand the logic of, and I don't, I'm sure no one would say that, that our finance and resources are kind of last in line in terms of priorities. Right. And there's a logic to the sequence. As someone who spent the last 30 years of my career reading other people's work and making edits to it, I have some suggestions, but is there a way that I could pass it on to somebody?
Would love to get those offline.
Okay.
I enjoyed reading this as well. I did have a follow-up question on the KPIs because I think it's really important to know what you're striving for. Will you be adding actual numbers or percentages to some of these?
Yes, I think our plan, and again, recognizing the KPIs are actually the last thing that we've been working on. So as a result, still a bit of a work in progress. The approach is to use our first year to establish that baseline and then use that to build on from there.
My reaction, very thoughtful. You've signed up for a lot of work.
Yes, we have.
Individual employee plans and the like. This takes a lot of dedication on that. On the KPIs, is that sort of thing that on an annual basis you would give a little report to the commission?
Yes, we love to do that. And in fact, on an ongoing basis, we'll be doing it internal as well.
Okay. So that might be, whatever month of the year, that might be a regular calendar item to put on.
So the other night at the joint study session, Councilman Tanaka talked about the idea of benchmarking with other utilities. And, you know, I noticed that in the document on page 11, it's talking about in 2019, update benchmark study for one utility, begin a process of regular benchmarking of one, I assume that's one of our utilities, per year going forward and complete by December 2019. So, you know, what do you see as the sort of setting up the criteria for benchmarking that you're using, and is there something that maybe there is published information, for example, so like the Gridwise Alliance does a benchmarking process that they have for grid modernization that might be something that already exists that we could just leverage and wouldn't have to be something that's so many years out and could maybe help us a little bit, sort of get a leg up on that.
I think it depends a little bit on what the focus of the benchmarking is, and that's something we're going to have to look at in the first year or so. Classically, with past UACs and councils, what we've been asked to benchmark is often around the water utility. We've done 3 water utility benchmarkings in the last 5 years, 6 years, and it's generally around cost.
Focused on rates.
Focused on rates and costs. So benchmarking against other utilities to understand, to dive deeper and understand why, for example, Palo Alto's water rates might be higher than surrounding agencies' water rates. That's one form of benchmarking that you can do, but other forms of benchmarking could be around performance or around specific initiatives like what you're talking about in the grid modernization area. Cost is it takes a lot of effort to get a cost benchmarking done, but if we were to tackle more narrow specific initiatives like you're talking about, that seems like something that we could do more quickly. I think it's going to depend on what the priority is around this strategy.
The opportunity, if anybody has edits or language to switch that on.
Yes, please, we very much appreciate that. Very good.
We recognize all the work that's gone into this and all the collaboration.
Thank you. Appreciate the UAC's input as well.
All right. We're still on schedule. Item 4, discussion of sustainability, climate action plan. And we got this document by emailing over the weekend. I don't know if everybody had a chance to read it, but I think the copies there.
Good evening, Commissioners. Jonathan Aubenschein, Assistant Director of Utilities Resource Management. Give me one moment here. I'm going to bring a presentation up. So we're here tonight to talk about the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan that is proposed for adoption on Monday to the City Council. You heard this plan earlier this year once, as did the City Council, asked us to go back and refocus the plan. Before I dig in too far, the person who's been leading the effort and whose slides I'm blatantly stealing is here, Gil Friend, our Chief Sustainability Officer. And I've also, we also have Christine Tam and Carla Daly, both Senior Resource Planners, who've been leading the internal efforts to develop joint work plans in the energy and water areas, respectively. I know we're trying to move through presentations quickly tonight in the interest of getting to discussion, and so we'll try to make it as quick as we can. But I think that this presentation, I think it's important to hear how we're characterizing the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan, and how the council will be hearing that on Monday. So, one of the first things that we've done here with the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan, and I would ask Gil to jump in if I miss any key important points here, but essentially we've narrowed it down to 4 higher profile areas of the plan. The other parts of the plan are not gone, but we're focusing on these 4 high profile areas for to focus on implementation over the next 3 years. Those are EVs, water, mobility, and energy. Just to reiterate, this is sort of this is a long-term view of where we're trying to go as an organization or as a community in carbon, and this plan focuses on the next 3 years. We're hoping to learn a lot and develop a lot over the next 3 years that we will use as a basis for achieving even greater carbon reductions over the following 10 years. In the area of electric vehicles, one of the things we've done is summarize try to boil down to the essence of what we're trying to, what we're hoping that the community, how the community will see our implementation efforts. And in the area of electric vehicles, the idea is to move from where we are right now to being perceived as having one of the most comprehensive programs in the nation to make owning and adopting an EV as easy as it possibly can be. Some of the things we've been focusing on and are going to continue to focus on, greater adoption of electric vehicles is going to require an enormous expansion of EV infrastructure. We started working on that in some of the public areas of the city. We've also started a program to provide rebates for charging equipment in more difficult to install areas like multifamily homes and smaller and medium businesses and nonprofits, and we want to expand on that. So infrastructure will be an important aspect of what we do, as well as communicating and collaborating and helping people understand how to make the most of an EV in buying an EV in Palo Alto. The next area I'd turn to is energy, and I'll ask Christine to speak to this.
So in the energy area, we are looking to do two things primarily. First is to go after all cost-effective energy efficiency. And the second thing is to shift energy usage from natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, to cleaner energy resources, namely electricity, which is carbon-free in Palo Alto. So while natural gas is still a fossil fuel and it's hard to clean up the way that electricity can be, we are currently using carbon offsets to compensate for the city's use of natural gas. This is, however, just a transitional measure, and we will only need to rely on carbon offsets for as long as we need to reduce our use of natural gas. We are going after both building efficiency as an incentive program, voluntary programs, as well as mandates. And this is an area that utilities is collaborating with development services to kind of go after as a two-prong approach. We also, as a city, is an early adopter of electrification, building electrification, with the heat pump water heater pilot program being kind of the first of its kind in the state. And this is an area that we are still hoping to pick up more traction, and hopefully we can continue to look at how to increase adoption of efficient heat pump technologies among our customer base. Clearly, all these electrification efforts is going to raise some questions and issues about how that impacts our electric supply, as well as the importance of resiliency as we continue to rely more on electricity usage. We will be addressing, and one more thing is the reduced sales on the gas utility. We need to address that also. So we will continue to explore these issues in the ongoing utility strategic planning efforts.
And moving on to water, Carla, you want to address that?
Sure. So we've done a really great job in the last few years of reducing water consumption through conservation and efficiency, largely driven by the drought conditions. But whether we're in an immediate drought or not, this effort to continue to use water as efficiently as possible will be our top priority and will continue to be. The other direction that we are really trying to go is to reduce our reliance on imported water and and move more toward this idea of using the right quality of water for the right use. So this is this idea that I think is a fairly easy one to rally behind, which is using pristine Hetchy water to flush toilets is not great. And so to the extent that we can move away from those improper matches between the quality of the water and the use, we will try and go in that direction. There's a couple of kind of key areas that we're focusing activities. One is with the recycled water from the Regional Water Quality Control Plant. This is a really important water source. It's obviously local, it's obviously sustainable, and to the extent that that water is put to beneficial use, it also helps protect the bay by reducing the effluent that's going into the bay from the plant. A couple of key projects that will be coming forward in the near term. One will be projects to improve the quality of that water, to make it more desirable and able to expand its use more easily. The second will be completing the recycled water strategic plan that will not only look at non-potable uses for that water, but project optionality in the future for potable uses for that water, be it indirect or direct. The other area that we'll be putting more focus on is non-traditional water sources such as stormwater and gray water. And stormwater management is, again, one of those areas where we not only could potentially reduce our potable water demand, but protect the bay by not letting all that storm water run into the bay every time we have a storm. So we have the green stormwater infrastructure plan that will help address the stormwater management issue.
All right, thank you. Moving on to mobility. This is an area I'm going to confess to having a little bit less experience with, and I know that there'd been some discussion at the joint meeting about the UAC having some, seeing this area a little bit. One of the goals, and I'd ask Gil if you could jump in, would you like to speak to this one?
Sure, Jonathan. Good evening, Commissioners. Mobility, as you know, is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions for Palo Alto. So for both climate reasons and also because the impact on congestion and quality of life, this is a really significant part of the SCAP. It overlaps, obviously, with electric vehicles and others, because the strategy here is fundamentally twofold. One is to make it more convenient for people to not have to drive or not have to drive individually. And second, where vehicles are rolling is to shift them from fossil fuel power to electric power where possible. So again, you see the same scheme of goals and overarching strategic moves, key performance indicators, and a collection of actions, some of which are already in motion. This is really true of all three areas that you've seen previously as well. And other areas where in the next few years we're going to do some careful evaluation, get a deeper understanding of what the options are, understand costs and impacts, and come back in work plans and proposals to council with specific cost-effective strategies. Some of them are in the realm of education and encouragement. Some may include incentives, and potentially some may include mandates. But that's something we don't know enough yet to even suggest. It needs some research to ground that.
Thank you, Gil. So that gives you an overview of what we're looking at as the sort of most important things to focus on over the next 3 years for implementing the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan. We do have some key performance indicators. We've talked about those a little bit. They're in the report, and I think that we could. I think if we just jump to the next steps. We're planning to talk to the City Council on December 11th. And over the next few years, we'll be continuing on this implementation plan and starting in FY19, starting to return for an updated plan for the following 10 years.
I think it's outstanding what's here. I do have some comments and observations, but I'll let other commissioners start.
This is a question that came up for me in connection with the SCAP, but it also, some of the other items we're going to be taking up this evening. And, you know, as I've been educated by my fellow commissioners, I have learned that, you know, our solar generation that we're so proud of, electricity generation, it doesn't serve us well at night. And have we looked at, if we succeed in electrification, if we succeed in, you know, vastly increasing the number of EVs, if we succeed in converting some of the heating uses that we now use natural gas to electrification, do we have the non-fossil fuel resources to actually supply that load at the time of day that load needs supplying?
So we will be addressing that. We will be looking at this through our integrated resource plan.
Okay.
I'm turning back to the audience because we do have the two project managers for that plan here, and I invite them up if they have.
I'm happy to defer the discussion to the other. I first thought about it when I was reading this, and then it kept coming up in the other items that we have tonight.
Yeah, it is something that's on our agenda. One of the things that I point out, though, is that we actually have a very diversified portfolio. You might be under the impression, you might feel like we have a lot of solar because solar is an important focus, but solar is about 30% of our portfolio. And if you look at, there is a strong seasonality, which I think goes to the issues around heat pump space heating that you've been raising. And so we'll be looking at that and talking with the commission about that. In fact, tonight a little bit.
Okay.
So why don't we maybe defer that for that later conversation. The one thing that I would point out, though, that I would also raise, though, is that around heat pump technologies, one of the things we're looking at is making sure that where we provide incentives for heat pumps, we're incentivizing heat pump technologies that are more efficient than gas technologies, even based on the California energy mix, which includes much more gas than Palo Alto's. And what that means is it protects us even if the solar plants aren't generating. We're still running more efficiently, even if we're running on gas, if we promote these efficient heat pump technologies. And so that's why we feel confident moving forward on those.
The other thing I would add here is that part of the, one of the elements in responding to your question is going to be energy storage, which is a rapidly emerging area. It's something that the utility has been looking at. It's an example of where the issues cross over, because as we grow our electric vehicle fleet, already probably the largest penetration in the United States, we have the opportunity of seeing those vehicles as part of the grid, as part of the storage system that we're looking at. So this is very challenging. It's a different way than we have looked at utilities in the past, and it's something that Palo Alto Utilities and others around the country are starting to grapple with, how to understand that, how to weave it in, how to optimize it, how to price it, how to manage it, and so forth. So that's something you'll see more from us over the coming years.
Others? Lisa?
Well, while we're on the energy plan, thanks for pointing out the important characteristic of heat pumps, that they be more efficient even when running on the California power mix, because I think that's an important point to make. Because I've often struggled with this comparison of if we're chewing up our electric portfolio with RECs, how is that different than chewing up our natural gas portfolio with carbon offsets? It feels like there's a certain similarity there, and why would we favor one over the other? But flat-out efficiency, nobody can argue with, that flat-out efficiency is to be preferred. I actually wanted to recall when we were talking about the carbon neutral gas portfolio and the issue of methane combustion versus methane leakage was sometimes kind of talked about, and it was a pretty aggressive policy change at the time to do what we did around natural gas combustion. I'm wondering if there's an opening or not an opening, but an opportunity through SCAP to also consider making an estimate of what our methane leakage might be, and to consider trying to carbon neutralize or whatever, true up the greenhouse gas emissions by purchasing carbon offsets against that as well.
So my recollection of that conversation was that we were talking about not just leakage in the, from the distribution system in Palo Alto, but leakage back to the wellhead. And I think in theory, that's an interesting thing to try and quantify, but in practice, it's really difficult, and there's lots of studies out there that are wildly different from each other. And so, I mean, it's not something I wouldn't say we couldn't do it, but it would require somewhat of a leap of faith on the numbers that then we would decide to offset. And so it's a difficult thing to quantify. There's not a consensus around what the number of that the leakage is back to the wellhead.
Another point to make is that under the state's cap and trade system, this doesn't cover all the way back to the wellhead, but within California, the cap and trade system makes the transmission owner responsible for the emissions associated with that transmission. Once you're outside of California, you're maybe not capturing those emissions, but California has at least taken a step in that direction. So we can rely on that to some extent.
Others? All right. Go, please. I'm sorry.
So I want to take a step back to how aggressive our goals are. Okay, that I think this idea that we have to have goals that are twice as aggressive as the most aggressive state in the United States seems to me to be about ego and not about practical judgment, okay? It just really bothers me because we are a pimple on what happens with the climate. And so if our goal is to be a model for other communities, then we ought to be a model that is remotely realistic that somebody else could do. So I think this idea of having to be so aggressive just doesn't make sense to me. The second point is that we're using this baseline from the 90s, okay, when we were a bedroom community, okay, and now we are a destination and we have all these businesses here, and so who we are and what we are as a city and what that means in terms of energy usage is really different. So to have this unbelievably aggressive goal based on when we had a different kind of community seems to me to, again, makes it even more unnecessary in terms of if we're really trying to be a model for someone else, okay? And I think why I feel like the building electrification is such a distraction is a couple of parts. One is that it's such a tiny amount, so I think it is not worth torturing people over for such a tiny amount. The other thing is that right now, what I think we have a much bigger problem is that we need to have this second feeder, okay, of our electric source. So to push for increased electrification before we've accomplished the problem of solving the second feeder is imprudent. Because if we pushed, even more strain on a system that could be broken in a way that would take a long time to recover, I think that would make things really, really difficult for the residents. And I think that at the very least, something that we ought to put as a higher priority, okay, is that we ought to be looking at purchasing transformers and switch gears, so immediately, these long lead time items, so if something happens to Colorado Street substation, we're at least in a position to get that back online immediately. So when we're looking at priorities and trade-offs, while I like 3 out of the 4, I think the fourth one is taking us in the wrong direction. And where we look at solar, our solar installations, again, we ought to be looking at we ought to be looking at microgrids and islanding, and if we're going to make DERs a focus, how do we have it where it can give us some resilience, not that everybody's inverters get shut down when there's if Colorado Street comes down, we're not getting anything from the solar unless we set up islanding and do another approach. So I just think that we have bigger fish to fry. And while I'm incredibly supportive of, the electrification of transportation, because we can be a model for somebody else, and because we have a chance to do something great, I think that's a very important focus. And I do want to say one other thing in terms of some of the goals that I see here with respect to how much we have to incentivize our fellow citizens to buy EVs, okay? I just don't know that I think community money ought to go. I like it that we're focused on infrastructure and charging, whatever. I think that's a much better way to go than to sort of giving rebates for people to buy EVs. I think we're already demonstrating that people in the community will do that. And so I just want to make sure that we keep our focus on the charging infrastructure and not on other kinds of incentives. Because when you said, there was something in the way that it was phrased that said, make it really wonderful or cost effective for people to buy an EV, it just struck me as it was kind of a larger problem than what we could have do as a utility.
So I think that whole frame on that first slide, let me go back to it. This may have raised that question for you. It was more of an example of what we want to be communicating and what we actually are communicating right now. So the first thing on our homepage shouldn't be, do we offer, even if it's a very common question, it shouldn't be, do we offer rebates? And the answer, no. The answer what should be up front is, if you're buying an EV, here's how you can get your infrastructure installed. Here's how you can partner with Palo Alto to make the most of your electric vehicle charging. Here's when you should be charging. Just helping people use their EVs most effectively. EV charging rebates from Palo Alto City money, I don't think are on the table right now. It was more a point about communication.
Okay, because I really think that the idea of doing solar canopies that can then become low-cost charging stations and things like that is a really great direction to go in, and those are the kinds of things that are good. Gil, I am not seeing, when the issue of vehicle to grid comes up in the conversations that I'm part of, I'm not hearing a lot of people who are thinking that's going to be really viable. For a lot of reasons that we can talk about at some point, but I think the idea of how do we do local solar or local wind as a way to charge vehicles in a way that makes sense. That's something that I think we have the opportunity to be very creative about. But anyway, so those are my comments. Thank you.
What stops more people from buying EVs in Palo Alto instead of fossil fuel cars?
I think at this point, we've got some opinions about that. We're actually, as a part of this distributed energy resource strategy, we'll be doing a survey that will hopefully get us a better handle on what the market itself says. I suspect there are strong opinions. One of mine, personally, is much of it may actually relate to the significance of the rental market in Palo Alto. I think it's close to 50% of our residents are renters. And as a renter, the likelihood of doing the kind of infrastructure upgrade at home to do a level 2 charger is in and of itself potentially problematic. So that may be an obstacle that, to the extent that we can both identify it, quantify it, and then decide if it's something that we want to try and help overcome. And how we might do that is one of the areas we want to explore as one example.
Yeah. And I would add to that, that's why charging infrastructure and multifamily housing seems to be a priority as we're thinking about it now. I think the other barriers, council member, one, of course, is price and performance, and that's not something that we control. The market is controlling that, and the price and performance is coming down. and the adoption rate of electric vehicles is accelerating. So that's something that we don't drive, but we need to be prepared for and respond to what we expect will be a growing population of EVs in the city. And I think the other factor is just public awareness. A lot of people have attitudes about EVs that have never driven in one or been in one, so they think they're underpowered, think they're dinky, and so forth. That's why we've done a series of ride and drive events over the last few years, where we give people an opportunity to come to City Hall or Stanford Shopping Center, what have you, and kick the tires and take a ride. And the response pretty universally is, well, I like this, I'm going to think about this for my next car. So that's a place where without incentives, but with some education, we can help the uptake. Critical, though, as folks have said before, is going to be the infrastructure and what role we need to play as a city in making sure that infrastructure is available and viable.
You know, and some people just want a luxury vehicle or a car that is really cheap or something. So I think the idea that this is one of those things about projecting from your energy, not you personally, but one's energy worldview onto other people, is that if you don't happen to have the green altruist worldview and you're more oriented towards comfort or cost consciousness, it's just not what you want. And I think that it is a mistake to imagine that everybody in Palo Alto cares about being green to the same extent that the people on the city council and the UAC tend to be. And I think that that's, you know, and we're not the only ones who do that. I mean, this is the thing that is really consistent. If you talk to people in certain states where they're really cost conscious, they do not believe, you know, you have these arguments that anybody would ever spend more for their electricity. They just don't understand that people care about trying to get renewables into the mix. So I think this idea of projecting one's worldview onto something is really common in this sector. It just is amazing.
That said, there are, given federal rebates and state rebates, and dealer incentives and rebates, there's some very, very low-cost electric vehicles out there. And I just want to, it's not a new thought, but I just really want to applaud the emphasis on making charging infrastructure widely available for people who rent, for people in multifamily housing, for inbound commuters, because I think that for many people that might be interested in, you know, leasing a Nissan Leaf for $175 a month, but they can't because they can't figure out how to charge without it being super inconvenient. I think that is removing a huge and important roadblock, and I'm glad to see that emphasized in the plan.
Thank you. So I have a few comments. I start with going at the GHG abatement cost curve in your Exhibit E. I don't know that you have it in your presentation at all. Yeah, there we go. Thanks. First, I think it's real important to think about abatement measures with this kind of methodology. What's the cost per unit of carbon that you're doing? And to point out, as Judith and others have said, residential space heating is an expensive one to address. You may do more good by building more forests in Oaxaca. There are also measures that aren't on here that are within our arsenal, and that would be building energy efficiency, for example, not just insulation, double pane windows, LED lights, but denser housing is going to save more on that. And so this doesn't really capture all the things at our disposal. And we ought to be thinking about if we are subsidizing heat pump, for example, what else could we accomplish with that $2,000 or whatever, and would we get more? I think that should permeate all of our thinking. And a lot of places in the plan you recognize that cost efficiency is important, and that I think it gets back to Judith's point of if we're going to be a model or an example, it's got to be based on cost-effective solutions to this. But it's not everywhere in this. For example, there's a point on page 5 under energy. It's use ambient resources, maximize the efficient capture and use of the energy and water that fall in Palo Alto. That may be true with respect to water, but if that means maximize solar energy that falls in Palo Alto, that may not be the most cost effective. We've had that discussion many, many times on that. So I think we need to get this cost effective, a more complete list of tools at our disposal. And I know you're doing a lot with the, why don't you comment, Bill? Gil.
I completely agree with you, and I just want to qualify that in prior drafts of both the implementation plan and the SCAP, we had a phrase that said, where cost effective, attached to every single action item. And we decided editorially that just didn't work. It's an overarching commitment. It pervades everything. Nothing we do, we can't, by law, we can't impose anything on our residents that's not cost effective. We don't want to pursue things that aren't cost effective. So it should be there at the beginning, I think it is, as an overarching disclaimer. That applies to everything. To Commissioner Schwartz, to your comment before about we don't want to go, beat people up to make them do things. That's not the strategy at any point. We don't want to compel people to do anything that's not in their interest, in their judgment. But what we can do is deliver them the best options that we can find and educate them about those options so they're aware of their choices and can make the decisions that make sense for them. So I think we completely agree on that. If I could step back, Commissioner Danaher, just to the point that Commissioner Schwartz said before about unreasonable goals. Unreasonably aggressive goals, I think was the phrase he used. I would say these are reasonably aggressive goals. They are aggressive, but part of the vetting exercise that we went through with the pretty substantial analysis in the SCAP and the work that staff has done over the last year on the implementation plans is to really ground truth this stuff and say, can we do this? Is this achievable within the boundaries of cost effectiveness, available technology, our implementation capacity? We think that we can. We think that that 80% goal by 30 is within reach. Not guaranteed by any means, but we've got 13 years to figure out, test approaches, and see how we can get there. And we may need to refine that goal. We may need to dial it down. We may find we run ahead of it. But I think there is an appetite in this community for doing something that is leading edge.
But the fact is that we're not able, there are other communities out there who are in a much better position to be able to leverage technology, okay, to meet some of these goals than we are. So we're a little slower to be adopting some of that technology, okay? So to assume that we're going to leapfrog everybody who's got really advanced smart grid infrastructure in place, and we're going to somehow, just by voluntary conservation, sort of do better than everyone, strikes me as very, it's just not realistic. I mean, the whole industry has been looking at how do we leverage technology to do automation and do things that are too complicated for people to do, just adjusting their thermostats and things like that. And maybe it's because I've been working in this area to think that there's a valuable reason to do it. If everybody could just do it with no infrastructure at all and just saying, oh, we're all going to wear sweaters. I think that there's been billions of dollars invested for no reason then. And I really believe that we're seeing the impact in different communities where the technologies make a difference. And I think that it's okay that we're a little slower to adopt, but then to be so much more aggressive in our goals when we're on the tail end of adopting these things just doesn't seem realistic to me.
Thank you. The cost efficiency has to be looked at cross-sector for everything. You do include building programs in this, but to get that integrated. Pick up another theme several commissioners have mentioned. Our electricity load at points in time is not carbon neutral. And the goal of electrifying all our gas supply may not be the most effective use of dollars to reduce carbon. So it bothers me to see that stated as the goal. in the long term is to eliminate entirely natural gas. That may or may not be the wisest use of our carbon reduction dollars. And so that may be a place where, Gil, we do include the where cost effective relative to other carbon reduction methods or something like that, as opposed to an absolute goal. And I do appreciate, and I know Jonathan, you said we'll get into that more later, getting a deeper understanding of how carbon-free is our load at given points of time, as opposed to in the aggregate, and how that drives our policies would be good. The last thing is I agree with what you've said on transportation. Point that came up in the discussion with council, and I've been wondering about it too, is we're going to see a rapid proliferation of electric bikes, and we're going to see smaller devices, hoverboards, electric skateboards, everything else. I don't know if there's anything we need to be doing to encourage that or to remove barriers or whatever. I just don't know, but it's something we ought to give thought to. There's going to be far more electric bikes than there will be electric cars, and they save far more energy, for example. And whether they need charging help, I doubt it, but more places to lock your bike, I don't know. That's something you ought to give thought to. In this case, where if we can be thoughtful about that, we can be an example for others, because those are very cost-effective measures for people. And even beyond that, I think we can look forward to a future with a lot more variety in transportation, much more small cars, for example, more autonomous vehicles doing deliveries and the like that'll reduce electricity. So I would include those in our thought process as we go ahead. Finally, I do think it is time, and other utilities are giving thought to how we do our charging networks and the role of utilities in that. I mean, I have meetings next week with a bunch of European utilities, car companies, and others in Paris on that topic, and I'll see what I learn there on that. But it's, and there will be an opportunity to use those as storage resources, maybe not to drive our load a lot, but for demand response or whatever. So that'll be an interesting thing to learn about as we go forward. So anyways, excellent work product here, and those are just some thoughts. Lauren?
I just had one more very low-tech comment, but it's sort of picking up on Councilman Phils's question about why some residents don't drive EVs. But on the other, or maybe not the other end, but on the bicycle side, why you see, I don't know what the percentage is, but a huge number of kids bike to school all the way through high school, even those with cars or access to cars and driver's license. And then you see this big drop off. And why is that? I mean, I try to bike as much as I can in the city. I can tell you there's no place to lock your bike once you get to where you want to go. That's a pretty cheap thing to solve. But there's a lot of reasons. There's not good east-west bicycle access. It's pretty much about getting to and from school, which is great. That's a great start. But if that's part of our goals, sometimes it's really simple solutions that can also make a big difference.
It's a great point, and bikeability is one of our success stories. I think the rate for high school in Palo Alto is about 44% bike to school, which is stunning. You may not be aware, but City Manager Keene has convened a mobility managers partnership. It's a monthly meeting of the city managers of Redwood City, Menlo Park, Palo Alto, and Mountain View, as well as folks from Stanford, to look at collaborative approaches to transportation issues and bikeability and bike routes and bike sharing and bike locking and so forth as part of that discussion. So it's a very apt point to raise. We've done pretty well, and we can do better.
There are a lot of creative approaches, some of them good, some of them bad. You could reduce the parking area at the high schools, encourage more bike to work. You reduce the number of gas stations in Palo Alto, make it more appropriate. You can get, as an example, small vehicles that are electrified, one-person things covered, so people can do their shopping in that. Get a few of those as examples in Palo Alto, and it might encourage others. Anyways, it comes down to convenience, cost, and in the case of high schoolers, what's cool? Somebody can change that.
Absolutely, and I think our approach is always much more carrot rather than stick. Let's encourage people rather than make the other alternatives more difficult. Let's make what we want easier, more economical, more effective, easier to do.
Can I just say one thing? We haven't talked much about water, and I'm pleased to see all the explorations of recycled water and non-traditional, non-potable sources of water on the list. On the theme of using our ambient resources, we had a public comment, it was many months ago now, sharing some data about basement dewatering, which, if true, was pretty shocking. And I'm curious if looking at, and the groundwater being, you could argue, an ambient water supply. I know it's not really the purview of the UAC per se, but I'm curious, on the other hand, on the theme of collaboration between city departments, if there's any updates on the way the city looks at basement dewatering.
Yes, as a matter of fact, next week at the City Council, there's an item for approval to codify some new requirements related to basement dewatering. It's currently on the consent calendar, indicating staff thought it was a pretty straightforward issue. That said, it's sparked some additional discussion of maybe not going far enough. So we'll see how that goes on Monday, but that will be the next venue for the council to consider the level of stringent rules there.
If I could just-
We've come a long way.
Yeah, the focus is on reducing the amount of dewatering water rather than putting it to use, because it's a very difficult resource to put to use. It's temporary in nature, and so you can't build a lot of infrastructure around something that's only going to be available for 3 months. So yeah, the focus on the proposal to council is on reducing the amount of dewatering water.
Very good, thank you.
Okay, so,
We talked about it more on the agenda item 4, less on this agenda item, on the variability management strategy. So, I'd like so we have you to
All right. Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Jim Stack, Senior Resource Planner in Resource Management. Here tonight for a couple of presentations. The first one on hydroelectric variability management, our strategy for addressing that. So I'll briefly give you a little background on the issue. I'll talk about some of the options that we've evaluated to manage the problem. I'll give you our recommended strategy, talk to you about our next steps for implementing the strategy, and get some feedback from you. So as you're all very well familiar, we have a very large concentration of hydroelectric resources in our supply portfolio. In an average year, we get about 50% of our total supply needs from the Calaveras resource and the Western Base resource. And I gave you some more details on this back in September, the last time I was here to talk about the IRP-related stuff. And that's a far greater concentration than the state as a whole has, which is about 10% of our statewide supplies coming from hydro. And as you're also familiar, our hydro supplies are very sensitive to weather conditions. This graph here shows our historical amounts of generation from the two resources in the bars compared to an average year in the purple line and our total load in the blue line. So you can see some pretty big swings here from the drought years of 2014 and 15, where we got about 25% of our supply from hydro, to the current year that we're in right now. We're going to be getting around 85% of our supplies from hydro. And then the other issue that you also probably are familiar with is that the amount of money we pay for these hydro resources doesn't really vary with the amount of precipitation we get or the amount of output they produce. We pay them about the same amount regardless of their output. So that results in some pretty big financial swings in our market purchase costs, because when we have a drought, we have to purchase some additional supplies to fill in the gap. And then in wet years, we have some additional supplies to sell. So this graph tries to illustrate that point. It shows in the blue line the amount of generation we've received over the last 6 years, and in the orange line, our total market purchase costs, and you can see a pretty strong inverse correlation between those. Back in 2014 and 15, our market purchase costs were around $15 million per year, and this year we're probably going to have negative market purchase costs because we'll have so much surplus to sell. So that's really the main issue that we're trying to address in this presentation. A secondary issue is the old intra-year variability issue, where we have, you've probably seen this graph before, showing month to month our supply resources and our load, and there's the mismatch between the resources we have available to us in the winter months where we have deficits versus in the spring and summer months where we have surpluses, but we won't really touch on that too much tonight. So there are four main options we've investigated for managing this variability issue. The first two are physical hedges and financial reserves, and these are two strategies that we're currently utilizing in Palo Alto to manage this variability. The third option is a rate adjustment mechanism, and the city of Roseville currently uses all three of these mechanisms to use to mitigate their hydro variability. And then the fourth option is weather insurance or derivatives, and SMUD actually has a very comprehensive approach to hydro variability, and they use all four of these options. And I had a chance to speak with staff from SMUD in Roseville to learn about their experiences and how they implement these different approaches. So the first approach, physical hedges, just involves making actual physical trades when we have a surplus or deficit position, and to make a fixed price transaction to mitigate our market exposure, excuse me. A more aggressive strategy under this approach might involve an actual long-term layoff where we sell a portion of our hydro resources, or we try to do an exchange with another utility, selling them some power in the spring and summer and receiving some power from them in the winter. Although I don't think it'll be challenging to find a counterparty who might be in a position to get involved in that trade. Then financial reserves, of course, we have the hydroelectric stabilization reserve to try to cushion ourselves from these swings in our finances. The next option is weather insurance. We haven't spoken about that very much before, so I'll go through that a little bit. Weather insurance contracts, they're highly customizable, just like any other type of insurance. The most basic approach is where you pay an annual premium in order to get financial protection when precipitation levels at a selected weather station or weather stations drops below a selected level. It's called the strike level. You can also structure these deals so that there's no annual premium, so they're essentially costless. And in that approach, you would receive a payout when conditions are very dry and precipitation is below a certain level. But in wet years, you would actually have to pay your counterparty when precipitation is above a certain level. So there's a lot more detail on this analysis in the report. I utilized an online weather insurance shopping tool called Weather Exchange, and got some quotes from some real insurance sellers for different contracts I structured. This graph shows historic precipitation levels at like a little index of weather stations they put together for me to kind of represent our hydro resources, which are sort of scattered across the northern and central parts of the state. This shows precipitation levels going back to 1950. So there's one contract I priced which would provide insurance against an extreme level of drought. This red dotted line here, where precipitation is below 10 inches per year. And that's a pretty cheap insurance policy. It costs about $400,000 per year. But you can see from this graph, there have been no years since 1950 where that would have paid out to us. For a little bit more robust level of protection, there's the black line at 25 inches of precipitation, and a policy providing that kind of insurance would cost about $700,000 per year. And you can see it would have paid out for 2 years out of the past 66 or so. For a little bit more, an even more robust level of protection, there's the dotted line, the blue dotted line showing 37 inches. And a policy like that would cost about $1.1 million per year. So it would have paid out for maybe 8 or so years out of the last 66, but we'd be paying for that every year, $1 million or so. And then there was one, I asked for quotes on a costless collar, and that structure would be giving us payment for precipitation below the 25-inch level, below the black line, but we would have to pay the counterparty for precipitation years above the purple line, the 63-inch level. And you can see there are quite a few more years where we would be paying our counterparty than where we would be getting paid by them. So ultimately, this looks like a fairly expensive approach for us, and we don't recommend pursuing a weather insurance strategy right now. So that takes us to our recommended approach, which is a rate adjustment mechanism. Essentially what this is would be a slight surcharge or discount added to a customer's electric rates. It would show up as a separate line item on their bill, just like the drought surcharge does. It's designed to pass through our additional costs in dry years related to hydro, and as well as giving back to customers additional revenues we receive in wet years. And the goal is to kind of maintain the rate stabilization reserve levels at a healthy level between $3 million and $35 million majority of the time, and to mitigate against severe swings that we have to where we have to raise rates quite a bit or lower them quite a bit. The way this would work is council would enact it in the spring, and at that point it would be at the very tail end of the water year, so we would have a pretty good idea of what the following 12 months would look like based on reservoir levels. So we'd have a good forecast of what our hydro situation would be, and we'd also know where our reserve levels were at the end of that fiscal year. We've structured this so there are 3 levels of rate discounts and 2 levels of adder, and the adjustment mechanism would be in place for an entire fiscal year before we reevaluate it for the following year. And this chart here shows how this particular structure is designed to be implemented. On the x-axis, we're showing hydro generation levels that the line in the middle at the 548 level shows the average hydro generation level for a year, and the 2 vertical lines to the left and right of it show 1 standard deviation above and below average levels of hydro generation. On the y-axis, we're showing reserve levels, going from the minimum level of $3 million up to the max of $35 million. So essentially, at the end of the spring, we would look at our generation forecast for the following year. And for example, if generation looked to be above average and reserve levels were fairly high, say $30 million, we would implement a rate reduction of 0.65 cents per kilowatt hour. And on the flip side, if generation looks like it's going to be on the dry side and reserve levels are already low because of a series of slightly dry years, we would enact a slight rate increase, a rate adder of 0.65 cents. And that would be in place for the following year. We did some modeling around this, and this slide shows what our reserve levels would look like with and without the adder in place, with and without the rate adjustment mechanism in place. For an extended drought situation, the reserve levels would start out at a reasonable level, and then as we get into the drought, the reserve would drop down into negative territory and remain down there. That's without a rate adjustment without a rate adjuster in place. So what we would probably have to do in this situation is do a pretty large permanent rate increase around year 6 as reserve levels get dangerously low. But with a rate adjuster in place, that's the top graph here, we would have a series of slight temporary rate adders implemented in years 6 through 10, and that would enable us to keep reserve levels at a comfortable level throughout that entire 20-year period. So this is just one simulation of a dry period. On the flip side, this is a simulation of a very wet 20-year period. So on the bottom graph, a series of wet years would result in our reserve levels shooting up to pretty extreme levels. So we would have to we would probably want to implement a large rate decrease permanently. But on the other hand, if we had a rate adjustment mechanism in place through a series of slight rate decreases, we would be able to keep the reserve levels, within our target range over that entire period. So I left out the next step slides, but essentially, if the recommendation is approved tonight, we would take that to Finance Committee in February, followed by the City Council, with the intent that this would be able to be implemented for starting in July 1st. So it would go into effect for fiscal year 2019.
All right, so I understand it. We set our rates high enough to create a reserve fund that's intended to protect us with even out perturbations within a range. And if it's too high or too low from that, we're actually, well, if it's too low for that, we make it up with, like we did 2 years ago, putting in place high increases. So in effect, we're borrowing from the future if that reserve fund is not high enough for a given. So this is just a mechanism for when our perturbations get outside the range anticipated by the reserve fund. We try to do a little bit extra so that we borrow less from the future. Am I thinking about it the right way?
I think that's a good way to think of it.
Who's affected, and how much would they be affected if this kicked in a given year, in the 5 or 10% adder? What does that do for a residential bill? And what does it do for an average business bill? And would it affect them much?
5% or 10%.
Yeah, essentially we have about a 5% increase for an average total.
And in dollars?
In dollars? For the total portfolio or for a customer?
For a customer.
What's our average?
Median customer bill is around 450 kilowatt hours a month, which gets you about a $55 or $60 bill. So it would be in the ballpark of $5, $250 to $5 a month.
I asked you on Monday, but I thought I'd ask again instead of trusting my memory. How about, are there any businesses severely impacted if we have an adjustment like that? The retail and office parks, I imagine, no. Do we have any other businesses that would be severely impacted?
Palo Alto's electric bills are fairly low, and a lot of our highest electricity using businesses, well, I guess what I'll say is electric bills compared to other utilities like water bills, for example, are fairly low. I think the impact of drought on water bills is more significant than the impact on electric bills. That said, there may be some customers out there that we might need to think about a little more carefully. So we'll take that as a comment and consider that. The other point that I would make is that the situations where you would need to put this adjuster on, you would need to do a rate increase anyway. I think the value here is that in this case, it's a temporary and transparent increase as opposed to a permanent increase that accumulates reserves and then forces us to hold down rates for a long period of time and then do a sudden large increase later on. It's a weird dynamic if you try and do it with permanent rate increases.
Thanks. Other questions?
I have sort of a tangential question. So do we have any control over when during the day, on a given day, we get the hydro resources, or is there someone else who's managing the resource and then we just get it whenever we get it?
Yeah, NCPA kind of schedules our load and our supplies, including our hydro supplies, so they try to optimize around the value they receive based on the market prices.
Okay, so does that mean that we could have more of our hydro resources come at night? Is that something that we could have some impact on?
That is something we could pursue. If that's not, if the market signals indicate that that's the most effective strategy for us, they would certainly pursue that. If we want to do that outside of market signals, for some reason.
For environmental reasons.
It's possible if council gave us that direction to pursue that strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question about that is whether it's desirable. I think there is, I think there's a real discussion to be had here. What you're talking about is essentially dispatching for carbon reasons. And I think there's a real discussion to be had about whether that actually saves carbon right now, given that most of the grid is, that the marginal, the next generator that turns on the grid or turns off is gas. We lose value for ratepayers by trying to dispatch, well, let me back up. If you try to dispatch a hydroelectric generator at night with the interest of saving carbon, you're not going to save anything. You're going to be displacing a gas generator regardless of whether you're generating during the day or during the night. In fact, during the day, you might be displacing, because everybody else is using electricity, you might be displacing a dirtier gas plant, and it might be better from a carbon standpoint, even if it doesn't match up with our load precisely, to go surplus during the day and displace additional dirty gas generation. So carbon dispatch, the way you're talking about it, might not actually save you anything, and you might lose ratepayer value. Now, we'd want to follow price signals. I mean, it may be that hydro needs to be dispatching more in the evening now because of the duck curve, but that's something that Northern California Power Agency focuses on and is always going to be trying to maximize value.
Okay. So I'm just clarifying that we can't use our hydro resource for that purpose in the way the market works. Okay.
All right, well,
Just to clarify, we can use our resources in that way if we have that direction. It's something we can pursue, but it's not optimal at this point to do that.
Right. The point that I was trying to make was not that we can't do it, it's that it doesn't provide any value to do it that way. That's all. We can do it if we wanted to, for some qualitative reason, match that hydro to our load, we could do it. But before we were to go down that road, I think we would need to really carefully understand exactly what the implications or lack of implications of doing that are. And that's something we can talk about as part of the IRP.
so that's very thoughtful, good suggestion. Are there any other comments or questions? Oh, please.
Thanks. So on the HRA, so then the idea would be to have basically a reserve that varies between $3 and $30 million to smooth out. Okay, and so it looked like on your chart, so the average value of the reserve would be like $16 million, and it'd be a little more in some years and a little less in some years.
Yeah, that's kind of the intent, to keep it around $17 or $16 million.
Okay. So the city's cost of capital is 4% or something like that. Is that? So then the cost to the city of doing this would be about $600,000 a year?
The cost of maintaining reserve levels at that level?
Right.
I think that's about correct, yeah.
But we do maintain reserves.
Yeah,
Right. You're talking about adding a new reserve.
You might say that this actually is a savings to the city if you're looking at it from a cost of capital perspective, because right now we have to maintain higher reserves because we don't have a rate adjustment mechanism. So this is actually going to allow us, even though those are very large, those reserves look big, they're not as big as what we have right now.
So let me see if I understand that. So you're saying that this reserve could come from existing cash the city has banked. So you wouldn't be talking about an extra $16 million that costs ratepayers another $600,000. Okay, cool.
Good point. It allows us to get by with less reserve. It's a different form of insurance. Okay. Well, staff's asked for us to recommend the council adopt such a policy. Is there a motion?
I'll move to recommend the policy.
Second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Mr. Stack, thank you.
Thank you.
We're only 15 minutes behind the projected schedule. That's pretty much a record for us. Let's move on to the renewable and carbon neutral portfolio strategy discussion.
Okay, that's me again. So thank you for the last discussion, and now we'll shift gears a little bit to the integrated resource plan. I want to start out with this, our slide showing the proposed work plan for the IRP. And we're starting to get towards crunch time now because we're only going to be coming back to you basically one more time in the spring, in March or April, to present some analysis around the different portfolios that we're considering for our long-term, our IRP planning horizon. I spoke to you a little bit about different portfolios we were going to consider back in September, and now we're doing some analysis, and we'll show you some results from the analysis in the spring. And then the next time we'll be back will be in June or July with the actual first draft of the IRP itself. And before I forget, like I did last time, I wanted to give a shout out to my colleague, Monica Padilla, who's done a tremendous amount of work on this, putting together the work plan and kind of guiding all the work on this project. So tonight I'll talk about some of the key policy questions that will be addressed in this presentation, talk about why we're actually here, what we're hoping to get out of this discussion, give you some background on our renewable portfolio standard and carbon neutral plans, talk about some of the issues and risks that we should consider when making modifications to these policies, and then present a series of potential changes to these policies. So this is our kind of laundry list of issues that we'll be tackling in the IRP. The highlighted areas are the ones that will be the focus of tonight's presentation. So now the objective. When we first started working on this report, the idea was to actually update the renewable portfolio standard policy language that we have in place right now, which is part of our long-term electric acquisition plan, or LEAP. But as we started working on that, we came to the realization that it didn't make much sense to update LEAP, which is going to be obsolete in a year when we adopt the IRP. So we kind of switched gears and changed this from an action item to a discussion item. And we're really here to kind of get some feedback from you on different approaches we might take in the IRP itself. This is also sort of a follow-up to the discussion we had in September around different portfolio options that we're doing some analysis on. So feedback from you tonight will be helpful to kind of guide us in terms of which of these portfolios to consider and how to weigh them against each other. So now for the background, we've had an RPS policy in place since 2002. We initially had a 20% by 2015 target. The state enacted its first RPS around the same time, although at that point the state's RPS mandate did not apply to public utilities like Palo Alto. It only applied to PG&E and the other investor-owned utilities. We accelerated our target to 33% by 2015 in 2007. We've had that at that level ever since, although, as you know, in 2013 we also adopted a carbon neutral plan. The state accelerated its target to 33% by 2020 in 2011, and that was the point at which the state mandate began to be applied to municipal utilities like us. And then 2 years ago, the state passed SB 350, which bumped the target up to 50% by 2030. And here is the actual RPS policy language that we have in place in LEAP Strategy 3. The main points here are it's a 33% by 2015 target. The resources that we pursue and that we consider to be RPS eligible are the same ones that the state deems to be RPS eligible, so we have the same standard for what counts. And also we have a rate impact limit of a ½ cent per kilowatt hour. So we've been instructed to pursue, as high as we can get in terms of renewable purchases within that rate impact limit. This is a summary of the state's RPS policy, which is part of SB 350. It has an ultimate target of 50% by 2030, with several interim targets before that period. The state law also establishes 3 different categories or buckets of resources, with the most valuable being bucket 1, which are in-state resources. And you're required to meet at least 75% of your target using these bucket 1 resources Bucket 2 is out-of-state resources. Bucket 3 is renewable energy certificates, or RECs, without the energy being bundled with them. And you're allowed to use meet your target using 10% Bucket 3 resources. And finally, a big caveat in SB 350 is that it includes an exception for utilities like us, which have a very large concentration of hydro in our portfolios. So in wet years where we receive more than 50% of our supply from hydro, we're not required to meet that 50% RPS target. So essentially this gives us the flexibility to, in wet years, kind of sell some of our renewables and hang on to the hydro rather than vice versa. The next slide shows the progress we've made in procuring renewable resources since we first adopted our policy. You can see that we've our procurements have accelerated in the past 2 years. About a year ago, our last solar resources came online. We now have 5 large solar resources that have been generating all year. So in 2017, we're projecting to be at an RPS level of 58%, which obviously is well above and beyond the state's ultimate 50% target right now. The next slide is kind of similar to that one, but it shows the entire supply portfolio, including our hydro resources. And this shows basically the IRP planning period out to 2030. With our net load being the dotted line there. So this shows kind of the evolution of our supply portfolio during that planning horizon. And then of course, and how we plan to meet the carbon neutral requirement. Obviously the biggest variable that's illustrated in this chart here is whether we renew our Western Base Resource contract starting in 2025. Because if we don't, that leaves us with a big gap to fill to maintain carbon neutrality. This next slide was also in the first presentation. It's the monthly look at an average hydro year, showing the variation between the winter months where we have deficit positions and the summer months where we have surpluses. Okay, so now to switch gears and talk about some of the policy changes that we wanted to discuss. Some of the issues that we wanted to have you guys thinking about while we discuss these issues are listed here. The first is the amount of the base resource that we will have in our portfolio beyond 2024. The second one is hydro variability, which we just finished discussing. Both annual variability between wet years and dry years and intra-year variability. The third issue is solar concentration, and if we pursue higher levels of solar in our portfolio, we have to be cognizant that that could come with some additional integration costs or large amounts of additional curtailment relative to what we're experiencing today as the rest of the state adds more and more solar as well. There's also some, we have to be aware of, congestion, because all these resources are kind of being built in the same area, and that depresses the value of each resource. Another issue to consider is the seasonal exposure issue. That's the mismatch between our load and our supply over the course of a year. Also wanted to think about potential for load loss and making long-term commitments that we might actually not really need down the road if our load continues to drop because of additional DERs. And the final issue is that all of our currently contracted resources or renewable resources are bucket 1. That's the highest value of category of RPS eligible resources. So I'm going to talk about some potential policy changes, but before I get to those specific changes, they kind of all revolve around the same two kind of real themes. The first is the issue of whether we want to pursue a higher level of RPS or kind of meeting carbon neutrality at the lowest cost. So do we want to have a gold standard portfolio of local bucket 1 resources that match our load and our supply, or do we want to try to maintain, keep our hydro resources and use RECs to try to achieve carbon neutrality at the least cost? And the second kind of overarching theme is, how much do we value resource diversity in our portfolio? Are we okay with concentration versus trying to spread out our resources? So the first policy change to discuss is the obvious one, whether we should raise our RPS level. We currently have a 33% by 2015 RPS requirement, so one obvious change would be to match the state's requirements. We could also choose to go above and beyond, as we have in the past, by having a 60% target or an earlier timeline or earlier deadline. The thing to think about here is that making a decision about where to set that ultimate target kind of needs to be considered at the same time that we consider whether to renew our Western-based resource contract. Because if we choose to maintain 50% of our supply coming from hydro, and then we at the same time set a 60% RPS level, that's going to put us in a very awkward position.
Now, let me interrupt with a question. There's no carbon benefit to our setting a higher RPS threshold, is there, if the rest of our supply is hydro?
I'd say that's accurate. There's no additional emissions value that we get from renewables versus hydro.
Okay,
No.
so the only consideration is what kind of planning do we have to do for 24 or 25, depending on what we anticipate that hydro resource to be based on our contract decision and anticipated rainfall and the like, right?
I think people have maybe some different opinions about the value of the relative merits of hydro versus renewables.
But it's not a carbon issue.
But
It's
from
just,
carbon's perspective, no.
it's just about reliability of supply and availability.
Yeah, and cost too, potentially. There are some risks around the cost of Western-based resource and the value of that long-term.
Okay, and we don't have to make a final decision on the Western until 2023 or 2024, is that correct?
That's correct.
We keep our options till the end?
Correct. We have to decide whether we're going to renew our contract, I think in 2019.
But that's a no-cost option, we're going to renew it.
We still have the ability to get out of it later on.
And then we get an exit in 2024.
Correct.
What is the lead time for acquiring other resources if we decide we're going to step down on the Western and need to put something in place by 2025? When do we have to make those decisions?
If we're going to do a long-term PPA, a 20-year PPA or something like that, ideally we'd have a couple of years of lead time, but we could do shorter-term transactions too, to kind of bridge the gap before we get a long-term.
So we might not need to make a decision on that till 2022 or something.
I'd say that's correct.
We'll have more insight into storage resources and cost of solar and other things.
Yep.
So what decisions do we have to make in the next 2 years then is what I'm puzzled with.
I think the goal here is to get some general feedback on the level of appetite for hydro versus renewables, whether we're simply concerned about carbon or whether we want to have kind of go for a more gold standard portfolio.
I think you're hitting on something that we've been wrestling with as we're going through our integrated resource plan. We are mandated to update this plan. That said, we don't have immediate decisions that we're going to have to make here. So I think what we're trying to do right now, both internally and with you, is to reassess our sense of where the market is and what our decisions look like long term. And then also what sort of policy preferences our community has right now. And that's what we're asking you tonight. We're about to launch an analysis to get a more quantitative sense of what different possible portfolios might look like and what the risks and potential trade-offs are of those portfolios. And what we're trying to get from you tonight is whether you have any either inherent preferences or questions and concerns that are maybe weighing on you that we need to take into account when we do that quantitative analysis. Does that make sense?
But we're not going to enter into any big new contracts in the next couple of years, is that correct? So our supply is sort of set for right now?
That's correct, yep.
I guess my initial reaction, I want to hear the rest of your presentation, is it's good to be open to these things. We want to see what trends happen in the rain and what happens in energy storage over the next few years. But in the meantime, you've got a good portfolio. Anyway, that's just, well, I'll hear the rest of your presentation.
Sure, thank you. Okay, another area where we'd like some feedback is on what to do in years where we have surplus supplies, like this year. One option would be to hang on to all of our renewables to maximize our RPS level and sell generic power. Another, on the flip side, we could try to minimize supply costs by selling renewables, which have a price premium relative to generic power. Our current approach is to sort of try to bank as much of our renewable resources as we can that are exceeding our targets, and try to, so we can use those in future years if we have shortages, and to meet carbon neutrality in future years if we have droughts. But there are sort of limits on the amount of RECs that we can bank for future years. So we don't currently have any direction about what to do in that situation where we've maxed out the amount that we can bank. So
this is purely accounting in some way, right?
Yes, and financial decisions about what products to sell in the market and whether to hang on.
So if we have our portfolio, we're getting our hydro, we're getting our solar and so forth, and we can sell some that's got a higher market price because it satisfies somebody else's RPS.
Correct.
And whatever we sell isn't going to change our real carbon thing. It may change what it sounds like to others, but my instinct would be to get the best price you can.
Yeah, and that hasn't necessarily been the interest or approach in from past UACs or past councils. Selling of renewable energy credits means that there's maybe less of maybe a perceived belief that there's less of an incentive for others to build renewables maybe, but that's been it's been a policy in the past. It doesn't have to be a policy in the future.
Padding our stats, partly.
What's that?
Padding our stats, is that part of it?
Possibly.
Yeah.
Or holding back, But we agree. I mean, there's a cost benefit to being able to sell those renewables, and if that's something people are open to, then it'd be interesting for us to hear.
I see nods from the fiscal hardheads on the left of me. I'd rather maximize the cash and use it for our energy reductions and mobility and other goals. Anyway, that's just personal opinion, but. Maybe you need to save some amount of RECs for insurance, I don't know, but maybe there'll be more RECs available in the future anyways as more solar comes online, and that's a resource with a lower value. I don't know, value trending down, I don't know.
What sorts of information I'm interested to hear from a range of commissioners, or to hear what sort of information people would like to have from us to be able to make that decision when we come with our formal proposals.
Well, I have a couple of questions and then kind of one reaction. I mean, I've been told the answer, but I've never really understood why large hydro is not within the RPS portfolio. I mean, if it's carbon neutral, to me, that should be as good a resource as these other resources which, get this gold star for being RPS. I just don't understand the distinction.
I think that decision was made when the initial RPS law was passed as kind of a political decision based on the north versus south hydro availability.
Because it feels like in your memo, it just felt like we were jumping over some hoops just so we could meet this don't want to say artificial number, but
Yes,
because it's
yes,
a legal
that's-
number.
yeah.
But this artificial RPS standard, when our real goal, I think, is to be carbon neutral, or carbon, get as close to carbon free as we can.
So there is a historical reason for it. I mean, you're right about that, and utilities have raised that as an issue in the past, as well as now, and I think it's an especially big issue for us.
And it sounds like we get some relief from in really wet years, we get some relief from having to have 50% of our generation from these Gold Star RPS sources. But still, we're going through a big exercise here to change the carbon neutral resources that we use.
So I just want to say that, like in the Pacific Northwest, where utilities get, basically 100% of their stuff from hydro, I think I'm in the camp of, I'd rather be looking at what we're really doing rather than just the artificial accounting things. And so if there's some portfolio diversification that I'd like to see us do, or to explore, is the idea of looking at geothermal, and use some of the vendors like LADWP are using, that we really can get nighttime renewables that really are instead of RECs. I mean, so I guess I'm in the same camp as Chair Danaher, that if it's all the same carbon point, then we ought to just get the money. And I think that if we really want to put our money at our mouth is and not be getting electrons from gas plants at night, then we should get some geothermal contracts and put our money where our mouth is. And so I think this is one of those things of, I'd rather us be sincere about what we're doing and really doing it than just sort of, giving lip service to something for bragging rights. And if we have all the, if the issue is that it's all carbon neutral, then let's get the most money that we can get to use for other purposes that are forwarding this positive green agenda.
Lisa, Lauren, thoughts?
I'm pretty much in the same camp. I would love to know what else we could do if we made that change, how else we could use the money, what other potential storage or other resources might be available. And then I don't know, I guess we'll go next to the more aggressive RPS piece of it.
Well, so RPS, again, it's accounting, right? What do we declare that we're using? The same, we're all carbon neutral any which way. So that's number one, isn't achieved. Number two ought to be the lowest possible cost for the utility. So we get the most money we can for selling what we can, and we put it to good use.
I thought either you said it or I read it, there's something, if we go above 50%, there may be actually some consequence if we're using hydro that we don't get this exception if we raise our goals.
I think if we established an RPS requirement for ourselves that was above 50%, then we might put that exception at risk. We might not have the flexibility to fall below the state's RPS target.
So we get the exception because we have the hydro.
Yeah, as long as we're maintaining our commitment to hydro, and then we'll still have that exception and the ability to sell some of our renewables and hang on to the hydro. But if we kind of require ourselves to go above and beyond the state's target, I think we might lose the flexibility to sell our hydro in wet years, or sell our renewables in wet years.
That seems to be a meaningful consequence of doing that.
Yep, I would say so.
Yeah. So I think you hear us saying, let's not increase the RPS. It's just.
Yeah. Okay, that's valuable feedback. This is different than we've heard from in past years. This is very helpful.
All right, good. And then come 2021 or 22, we'll want to hear about the new generating technologies, the new storage technologies, and the cost of water.
Okay, great.
So just to clarify one thing, though, on the surplus supply management, it's not clear to me we should stop banking RECs for our own, because that's just against our own future need for RECs to fulfill whatever RPS requirement we've got from ourselves or from the state. So if my understanding is the question was about when we've reached the banking limit, then what the UAC is saying is get the best price possible. And my follow-up question to that is, I mean, you might probably not have the number in front of you, but like how much funds are we talking about how much money would there be available from this practice possibly? And is it in fact the case that we would then be able to say, that pot of money we can now use for these programs we're excited about? Or are there reasons that we wouldn't be able to disperse that?
Well, I have an estimate in the next slide about the financial opportunity from selling some bucket 1 and buying some bucket 3.
Why don't you continue?
I think the total, if we chose to just meet the state's requirements, just the bare minimum requirements for RPS, we could sell even more. So the total opportunity might be higher than is presented here. Because right now we're going above and beyond our RPS, the 50% requirement. So we could sell more and replace it with cheaper hydro as opposed to bucket 3 RECs.
Yeah, I think it's the same problem we're just talking about. We're going to be carbon neutral either way. Sell the one you get the higher market price for. And at $450K per year, that'll pay for our gas offsets and an office party.
Sorry, but I thought the buckets were not about whether you set your RPS, given an RPS, then you can meet that RPS with one of 3 buckets. And we're currently meeting our entire RPS with bucket 1, which is a different thing than saying let's have a different RPS. Sorry, I'm getting confused between the buckets and the banking, I think, or the buckets we need to purchase from when we need to purchase RECs versus how we would sell them. Can you clarify?
Sure. Let me try. It's kind of confusing, I admit. So there's the 50% RPS requirement, and you have to meet that using 75% bucket 1. And right now we're at 58%. So we could sell some of our, that 8% excess to get down to 50%. So we could just sell that and not replace it with any renewables, just with just generic market power and RECs or hydro. And then once we're down to 50%, we could also swap out a portion of that, that 25%, or I guess it would be 10%, we could swap out from the bucket 1 category for bucket 3. So there's kind of 2 opportunities there, kind of reducing our RPS level and then swapping out the high value bucket 1 category for the bucket 3.
But now you're talking about buying buckets, not selling buckets. Now you're talking about buying RECs. You're buying cheaper RECs because we can, cheaper sort of lower quality RECs because we can, as opposed to selling RECs that we've from energy that we've generated in excess of our own needs and selling them for the highest price. We're talking about buying for a lower price.
I'll flip to that slide. So the swapping opportunity, that is both buying and selling RECs. So you'd be selling some bucket 1 RECs and energy and buying instead bucket 3 RECs, the lower quality, lower cost RECs with generic market power.
By
generic meaning
market,
hydro.
Well, is it hydro or is it gas fired?
essentially the bucket 1 RECs are more expensive, the bucket 3 RECs are cheaper, and so we'd sell our expensive bucket 1 RECs that we get from our renewable energy sources like solar, our long-term contracts, and we would buy bucket 3 RECs, which might come from resources that have been around for 20 or 30 years, or 20, it wouldn't be hydro, it would be actual like old wind, for example, that's been around for a long time.
But it's going to be renewable anyways.
Right, zero carbon to zero carbon, it's just one is cheaper and one's more expensive.
So we're caught in a vocabulary issue. The council says we want 50% RPS, when really should say is we want 100% carbon neutral, and ignore whether it's RPS or whether it's hydro, or whether it's old wind or anything like that.
Summarize here? I mean,
Please.
it sounds like what you're saying is that basically hydro is undervalued relative to other renewables for political reasons. Is that basically what you just said, right?
I think you could, interpret it that way.
So,
from a carbon
so
perspective.
to have an opportunity to profit from other people's political posturing and not take that opportunity, that's a mortal sin.
Let me just ask another question, because does the RPS strategy that we're talking about, how does this play into our SCAP strategy, that, our goal to get to, 80 by 30, do we have to maintain a higher than 50% RPS in order to meet that SCAP strategy?
I don't think so. I think the SCAP is all about carbon, so that's what we're concerned about.
SCAP doesn't care whether it's hydro or...
Correct.
That's the key question, I think. Yeah.
I think RPS is, in artificial term, you said it doesn't count other types of renewable energy, but as a practical matter, it shouldn't make any difference.
Right.
So let's take advantage of other people's accounting systems if we need to. And does that help you? Is that the right guidance?
I think so. So is that, would the direction then be to pursue the bucket swapping opportunity here?
As fast as you can.
That's very direct, thank you.
I'm not as convinced as the rest of my colleagues, and in particular because it's the state's least preferred. Like, I don't think hydro has anything to do with it. It's renewable energy credits. And I would like to understand why it's the state's least preferred if it's every bit as renewable and green and carbon-free and everything else that we like.
Because it's who has better lobbyists at a given time.
Do you agree with that statement? It's entirely political and who has better lobbyists? Or is it perhaps harder to trace and track and lossy or some other side effect?
So bucket 3 is largely from out-of-state resources, where, say, it might be from Wyoming, and rather than transport it all the way down to California, they generate it with a wind turbine up there, they use the electricity locally, and then they, the person who buys the electricity just buys the electrons, and then they sell the REC to California. So, it gets rid of the problem of having to transmit the electrons all the way down here. I think from the state's perspective, in-state renewable energy generation is preferred, certainly by lobbyists for construction jobs and so forth. In-state, that's one reason why we had the distinction there. And there are also those who argue that RECs aren't as valuable or as real as from an environmental perspective as actual generation in-state or local.
We have surplus RECs, and the question is, how do we trade them? Do we trade them for cheaper ones and get, collect the difference on that? Is that right? It's not about our production or our consumption. It's just about how we trade the RECs, right?
Not sure I follow.
Well, we have production that exceeds on an annual basis our consumption. It's all energy neutral. And our production is renewable. So we generate a lot of RECs.
Yeah, certainly.
And if we, quote, keep for ourselves the credit of the generic hydro, then we have more surplus RPS RECs, which we can sell.
Yeah, that's true.
And if we sell those, and for those points where we need to make up for the shortfall in a day or a month, we buy other RECs that we can. In other words, none of this is changing our, none of this is changing our load. None of this is changing what our production resources are. We have the long-term solar, we have all of it is just financial finagling around trading of RECs. Is that really what we're talking about? And how we label things?
I think if we were to go aggressively down this path, we might consider a long-term layoff of some of our, say, solar contracts. We might sell an actual PPA to another counterparty, another utility. So we might, reduce the amount of actual generation in our portfolio if we wanted to pursue this long-term.
How would we make up for that generation?
Well, currently we have a little bit of a surplus situation, so to some extent we wouldn't need to make up for it. And then if we wanted to sell, more aggressively, we would probably make it up. We could make it up with market resources and bucket 3 RECs. We could make it up with, and when I say market resources,
but a
I
REC
mean
doesn't generate any power. It's just it covers basically non-carbon-free power that we buy. Okay. What I'm interested in, what I was raising earlier when we started talking about the SCAP, is what are our strategies to reduce the amount of brown power that we have to buy when our own resources are insufficient to meet our load? I mean,
That's where we'd have to get something like geothermal that ran at night. Okay,
Right.
that's a renewable, that is deployed at night. So you have to, if we want to look at like our carbon, carbon content 24 hours a day, that's a different exercise. And so we may want to do that. But I think that's a different, but from what they're talking about from the financial standpoint, it's
I
just
get
as
that, but
kosher.
I thought we were going to have a discussion about, about how we reduce the purchases of non-carbon-free power. And I thought we were going to.
That is not what this is.
No, I get that now.
Go ahead, Lisa.
I think that's a fair point. I want to maybe speak to that because I was the one who maybe led you down the road with false promises, I guess. We should speak to that a little bit right now. One of the things we're going to be doing is, one of the things we're going to be doing in the integrated resource plan analysis, we don't have that for you tonight, but we're going to be looking at what it actually does take and actually queue up that discussion of what it actually costs to run to actually supply renewables during all of those hours to start giving us an idea. And I think just going back to your point, Chair Danaher, about what decision are we making, what problem are we actually solving? I think what we're exploring here actually has a lot to do with the SCAP, maybe more than our long-term integrated resource planning, and it has to do with this question about where's the energy going to, where are the renewables going to come from on that dark winter night?
Well, that's a separate topic in my view, because we have right now our contracts in place, Western Calaveras and other things. So we know for the next couple of years where our power is coming from. And back to slide 15, seems like a pretty easy decision to say, we'll keep for ourselves the hydro and sell the RPS. It's just an accounting thing, and whatever money we bring in, we can put in for more charging networks or whatever we want. But that might be a great use for it. The second issue is, to the extent we do buy RECs for when we have a shortfall, do we buy the cheap ones or the expensive ones? We have room to buy the cheap ones because we're already so high on the RPS, I guess. That may be more room for debate on that, my inclination is if you could save $450,000 a year, that pays for a lot of chargers. Or other mobility things or the like. And
But do we have a,
Yeah,
do
heat
we have
pumps,
an obligation at that point to our ratepayers to lower rates? So we wouldn't actually get $500,000 a year to spend on other items that we believe in?
I think it's always a policy choice whether to spend, whether to start additional programs or to reduce rates. That's always a policy choice. And so I think it would be up to our, up to the council. We'd of course make a recommendation, but it would be up to the council, based on your recommendations, whether we would want to return that money to ratepayers or whether we had specific programs that we wanted to fund. That's all.
But we're not constrained by cost of service type constraints?
No, cost of service isn't. Cost of service only requires that we charge ratepayers according to the cost to serve them. And if we increase the cost to serve them by starting additional programs that are, legitimate utility functions, then that's a cost of service.
so the UAC Council looked at this 2011 to 12. We had a much different production mix then. We didn't have all the solar that we do now. And we didn't have the surplus of renewables. So we're in a different situation. I think different response is appropriate.
Thank you.
You had another slide.
Yeah, one more about diversification. So as you know, most of our resources now are landfill gas, wind, and solar, besides our hydro. And we have, up to this point, kind of pursued an agnostic approach when we go out and procure new resources, just trying to be objective as possible and maximize the value rather than setting any kind of thresholds for different types of resources or diversification requirements. But obviously an option to consider would be to set some thresholds on maximum levels of solar or minimum levels of geothermal or baseload resources. I guess the argument in favor of doing that is that it could provide a hedge. Having a diversified portfolio provides a hedge against different changes in the market or regulations going forward.
But am I correct? We're unlikely to enter any contracts in the next couple of years, right? Unless we offloaded something?
Correct.
Okay.
But that will be a key discussion when we start getting closer to having to make a decision about what to do about the Western contract.
I definitely think it should be considered, but also in the context of storage and whatever other technologies come online. But it's not a 2018 thing, it doesn't sound like.
Okay, I guess with that I'll summarize. There are 4 different policy changes we've discussed tonight for RPS and carbon neutral strategies. They all sort of boil down to the questions of how important to us is cost versus simply carbon reduction at the least cost, and how important is diversification. We've gotten some solid feedback, so thank you very much for that. If you have any additional thoughts or wanted to elaborate on anything, please feel free.
Most carbon reduction at the least cost. I think that's the goal. Yeah, all right. But thank you for bringing up, this looks like an old policy. Circumstances have changed, so really good of you to re-examine that.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right. Good. We had great topics for tonight's discussion. I really appreciate it. The selection of potential topics for future UAC meeting.
Yes, just a quick reference to your rolling calendar. As I mentioned, we'll be doodling for a new date for January. I think all likelihood it will be the latter part of January, which won't provide a whole lot of space between your January date and the February scheduled date. So we'll see how that all comes together. You do have quite a few things on that January list, so we'll see how the balance between those two come together. On the topics, and actually one item that's not listed but is identified in the strategic plan. It's coming back for further discussion around resilience and what the strategy, scoping, what that actually consists of. We're putting together some thoughts that we'll haven't quite figured out a date to bring that back to you on, but clearly that's an issue that bubbled up from the commission of interest. So we want to provide some suggestions on how to give that some shape and next steps. Go ahead.
So since this was published, the January calendars lightened up a little bit. We're going to be moving out some of the distribution systems assessment and the recycled water project evaluation to March and February respectively, I think. So we'll be updating that and going from there.
All right, any
So
further
the
questions?
main thing in January then will be the strategic plan approval. That'll be the primary topic.
As you see on here, an update on the cross-border program, which I know Commissioner Trimble had indicated wanting to get into. So we'll bring that back as well.
I just want to say, because I'm going to be at Distributech on the 24th of January, so hopefully it won't, which is a Wednesday, so hopefully it won't be that day. But I do want to have us sort of get an understanding of the people in Palo Alto who are having trouble paying their utility bills and what's going on, and sort of I think we tend to overlook the people who have financial problems in town, and I'd like that to be, it doesn't have to be in January, it's whenever we can really do it, but I think I'd really like us to have that be a topic we discuss. And I'd also like to maybe, if there's going to be some surveys of the community, to talk about segmentation and what that might mean, and so that since this is our public opportunity to have those conversations, it'd be great if that could be a conversation we could have with the whole UAC.
Right, I think we can fit that within the context of some other things we're bringing forward and make sure that we make that explicit.
And the last thing, not for January, but council wanted to spend us more time on fiber, so we have to figure out how we address that.
Agreed, yes. So we're putting together some resource planning around that right now, and so we'll be able to do that as well.
I would love to start with an educational session about our existing fiber utility, since we haven't talked about it very much. It would be great to have a baseline of shared knowledge about the fiber utility we already operate.
That's good. I think that fits together very well.
Okay. Anything else? Motion to adjourn? So moved, it looks like. All right, adjourned.